Okay, one of the more difficult skills to master in light tackle jigging is dealing with heavy wind. Here the wind is blowing about 15 to 20 miles per hour, and I'm still using my quarter-ounce jig with a gulp trailer. It's not the easiest fishing, but I'll have my limit before the day's over. So tip number one when you're jigging in heavy wind, you must manage your slack. Before your jig even lands in the water, close the bail and pick up most of your slack line with the reel while pointing the rod tip down. Keep as much braid out of the wind as possible. Tip number two, pay attention to the wind direction. It is much easier to cast either directly into the wind or with the wind at your back. This keeps your jig, line, and rod aligned to your body for most of the retrieve. When the wind is blowing, it will dictate your casting angles almost entirely. In this video, you'll mostly see me angle my casts into the wind, and later in the day when the wind shifts, I change my casting angle to match it. Now, casting into the wind is preferred since the wind is pushing your rod blank towards you, while a fluke would generally pull the jig away from you, so the bite transmission will be more obvious. Bite detection is a little worse with the wind at your back, since both the wind and the fish will be pulling the rod away from you in the same direction. Hopefully that makes sense. But both of those scenarios are much preferred over casting across the wind. Wind coming in sideways will create a big bow in your braid and make you lose all contact with your light jig. If you find yourself unable to keep the wind at your back or cast into the wind, I suggest keeping your rod tip low to the water and giving the wind as little slack to work with as possible. Here's an example of 30 miles per hour gusts. The wind is onshore, not sideways, but the idea is the same. My rod is pointed at the water, and I'm keeping as much braid as I can out of the wind in between working the jig. I'm also taking up all the slack line with my reel and keeping everything nice and tight. I'm taking more time than usual in between pops to index the jig, making sure it's back on the bottom. A lot of work for sure, but you can catch decent fish even in those conditions if you keep practicing. Okay, tip number 3, keep your cast short, especially in any kind of onshore wind. Wind will delay your reaction time for hook sets. It will introduce more slack in your line as your braid is being blown around above the water. And in my experience, it will position fluke closer to the first break or the surf line itself. So instead of making a 120-foot cast along the bank, break it up into two 60-foot casts at the same angle. Simply walk a few feet between casts to cover that same ground. And this leads me to tip number 4. You should always be covering water when fluking the open beach. But when it's windy and you're limited in both casting distance and casting angles, covering water on foot is even more important. Another reason to cover ground in the wind is to find correct casting angles, using the shape of the beach to your advantage. Even a straight north-south running beach will have random points and bars at different angles to the wind. And finally, if you know you're going to be jigging in heavy wind all day, it's probably better to use a shorter rod. Here I'm using my 9-foot Lebrax AGS, and I wish I had my 7-foot 6Ds instead. The longer rod will reach higher in the air, catching even more wind, and it's also more tip heavy, and you end up fighting the rod a little more than if you're jigging with a shorter 7-footer. This is also when rod sensitivity can play a major role in your jigging success. Being able to distinguish between wind gusts pushing and pulling on your rod and braid versus a fluke bite, and just keeping track of your jig and the water in general. That's where the money goes into when you buy higher end rods. Now, it might be tempting to tie on a heavier jig when the wind kicks up, but that's usually the wrong move because you're not fishing any deeper when the wind is blowing. The wind is simply making your connection to your jig more tenuous. The jig is still down there doing its thing. Okay, here's the last keeper and my limit achieved for the day. I did catch another limit with a jerkbait when the wind died down in the early afternoon, but that's for another video. Hopefully you guys have checked out my other tutorials that I released this year. I'll leave links in the description below, along with all the gear I use in this video. In any case, I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.